Hi again, welcome back. This is the Part 2 lecture for Week 5 in History 322U. This week's lecture is about the Chinese Revolution and the defeat of Japan, so we're going to go through now the period of the Anti-Japanese War. But first, let's look at some precedents. Let's go to slide 3. As you read through the history of this period, it's interesting to look back at the Korean period that came before, which is part of this week's reading. At least I can see some echoes from that period in the way the Japanese pursued their policies in China. I've listed them all here, and I don't want to go through them one by one, but if you look at the reading and you think about these things, it seems like there's some parallels in the surprise attack that was used, that was, as we noted previously, not a Japanese invention by any stretch of the imagination, but still was carried through as part of military policy. Surprise attacks do have their advantages. Plus the way that the Japanese occupied and treated their subject peoples in Korea seemed to be a precedent of sorts in the way that they treated the Chinese. And part of this stems from, let's go on to slide 4, part of this stems from the self-image that the Japanese had, and indeed had a conflict it ran up against, the self-image of the Koreans and of the Chinese. Each of them has felt traditionally that they were superior to the neighboring peoples, and unfortunately this has led to brutalization. One can't say that it's a cause and effect thing, in my opinion. If you examine closely the history of the Korean War, which we'll touch on in the next couple of lectures, you can see that the communists treated their own people with brutality. The Republic of Korea in the south, their armed forces treated their own people with brutality. It simply was a very difficult time in history. Let's go on then to the next slide briefly, slide 5, a quote to remember. This journalist used to be a household word amongst some back when I was your age in the 70s and 80s. And interestingly, he's the model on which one of the characters in Year of Living Dangerously is based, one of your assigned movies that is available through D2L. He was the model for the character Wally O'Sullivan, the older Australian journalist who is part of that small group of people that become Guy Hamilton's colleagues. Anyway, enough of that. Let's go on to the Anti-Japanese War and the Communist victory, skipping past slide 6 to slide 7. When Japan attacked, for reasons that we explored in the previous lecture, their attack sparked some unity on the Chinese side. The antagonists, the communists and the nationalists, cooperated to some extent as they encountered each other on the battlefield, but unfortunately this cooperation did not last long. There are some claims in the literature about the military and the intelligence units on the Chinese side that they gave assistance to the nationalists. On the nationalist side, when they write about these things, they tend to emphasize the betrayal of the communists, and indeed the communists emphasize the betrayal of the nationalists. When you examine writings about each other on both sides, there is this constant theme that the other side is black and we were white. The truth is, I hate to say it in these terms, but somewhere in between. Both sides were extremely brutal to each other. Both sides had their people who were idealists and put the nation first, but typically speaking, both sides realized that the other was out to get them, and so they behaved accordingly. Let's go on to the next slide, and this led, here we are on slide 8, this led to cracks in the United Front. The United Front was called the Second United Front because the First United Front was when the Communists and Nationalists worked together before and during the Northern Expedition between 1923, when things really started to when they joined each other's party, when the Communists joined the Nationalist Party, not the other way around, on Stalin's orders, until the April 1927 coup. That was the First United Front. This Second United Front to fight Japan had its problems. It was not as successful as the First United Front at all. Both sides were extremely wary of each other, and their cooperation really was rather minimal. It was formal, and there were some exchanges of information, certainly, but people at the unit level were highly suspicious of each other, and there were often battles that would erupt between them. One of the biggest battles that erupted between them was this New Fourth Army incident, which has several names, but in English, most commonly it's known as the New Fourth Army incident. In January 1941, where the Nationalists surrounded and mostly wiped out a large force, taking them from about 10,000 troops, I suppose, to 2,000 that escaped eventually. That ended everything but the most formal cooperation at the upper levels. The underground and intelligence war between the two sides resumed in full, whereas before there had been some expectation of maintaining common effort. After that, there was none. After that, when guerrilla units in the field behind enemy lines from either side encountered the other, generally they either attacked if they felt they could win, or they avoided confrontation if they didn't think they could win. And so, besides battling the Imperial Japanese Army, the IJA, behind Japanese lines, they regularly battled each other. Let's go on to slide 9. The Japanese attacks against Chinese forces, mostly against nationalist forces, were relentless. And again, there's that word brutal. Again, they were very brutal. There was no mercy. The Japanese pursued a policy that they called burn all, loot all, rape all. And indeed, it was exactly what it was, as it was termed. There were major battles to defend cities on the dates that you see here. When I write 1937.10, of course, that means October 1937, and so on. And these cities fell with a lot of bloodshed. The Nationalists didn't just retreat. They put up quite a fight, but in the end, Japanese superiority was crucial. And indeed, this you might say that this vindicated in part Chiang Kai-shek's hesitancy to go to war with Japan. Many people wanted war with Japan. Many people wanted Chiang Kai-shek's government to resist Japanese encroachments. But what he was doing, in retrospect, was buying time to arm his own forces, to prepare defenses, and he ended up going to war sooner with Japan than he wanted, because he knew that once war began, that it would be one relentless series of attacks, successful attacks against his forces after another, and indeed that's what happened. And there were enormous casualties as the war progressed. And so the Nationalists made the decision to retreat first to Wuhan in central China. Often you'll see, by the way, Hankow, Hankow in the old spelling, or Hankow, Hankou in the new spelling. That's one part of Wuhan, just like Minneapolis is part of Minneapolis-St. Paul. Anyway, they retreated there first, but they had to give it up and decided to go inland to Sichuan. Sichuan lies in a basin in southwestern China. As far as the PRC goes today, it's in south-central PRC, but in terms of China proper, not including Tibet and Xinjiang, it's southwest China. So Sichuan and the main cities of Chengdu and Chongqing, which was known at that time as Chongqing, sit in a basin and in the middle of a rice basket. It's the rice basket of China, you might say. It's a very rich area agriculturally. And so the Nationalists decided that this was a good place to make their wartime capital. In the course of moving there, they moved entire institutions, such as universities. They packed up factories and moved them and positioned them in this place, which soon became flooded with refugees, and it was destined to become China's largest city, which it is today. Let's go on to slide 10 and look at the numbers. The numbers were awful, and I'm not going to recite them here, but you can see them. They come straight from the readings in Westad, and I think I threw in another one that I found somewhere else. But the incredible destruction of the first phase of the anti-Japanese war was principally borne by the Nationalists, and this was the beginning of the end of their governance of China. I haven't spent much time, and I really should have, in these slides to talk about the Nationalist Decade, as it was called, which is often overlooked, and I want to say a few words about it before we continue. The Nationalist Decade refers to the time between the coup against the Communists in April of 1927 and the beginning of the anti-Japanese war in 1937, in September or July 1937. And during that decade, there was relative peace in the cities, except for occasional terrorism by the underground communists on one side and also by the nationalists on the other against the communists. And during this time, the nationalists were very successful in building up services in the cities and in building industry and in constructing a government. So they had some successes in these realms. It wasn't everything it could have been, certainly, because there were constant problems with corruption. There was this war that was being fought against the communists at the same time, which drew a lot of resources. And so it wasn't perfect, but it was an era when nationalist power and the power of the central government, the influence of the central government grew. And it was generally a time of peace. And this is the basic reason why Chiang Kai-shek tried to maintain peace with Japan. But the problem that the Japanese faced was that they needed to expand for their own reasons, which we'll get into in a few more slides. And so the pressure for war on both sides mounted as people became, on the Chinese side, more and more outraged at Japanese conduct. Let's go on to slide 11. So in 1940, the Japanese had seduced the major KMT figure Wang Jingwei to come over to their side. He, as you may recall from last week, Wang Jingwei was a senior figure from the KMT, one of the party's founders. I haven't included a picture of him here. A picture of him was in last week's lecture. He was a very capable, very savvy, and an attractive figure who was able to head a government who had that capability and had that ambition, which is one reason why the Japanese targeted him to be the head of their puppet government. It was never anything more than a puppet government, and you get a good sense of those times and of the people. If you take a look at the movie Lust, Caution, of course be sure to get a copy that has English subtitles. It's available through Interlibrary Loan. It's around. I didn't want to assign it because it has a lot of sex in it, and it was very controversial for that reason. But it does have good historical aspects, good flavor of the times. And it's based on some real characters. The two main characters here, for example, are based on real people, although the events that transpired between them are not precisely depicted. Anyway, it's interesting, as Westad points out in the readings, that there was not nearly as much retribution against members of the Wang Jingwei regime after World War II as you would see in other occupied countries at the behest of victim peoples at the end of World War II, especially France. I'll stop this here and we can continue the recording on slide 12.